Right now, if you walk down Mitropolitou Iosif Street, right in the heart of Thessaloniki, you are probably dodging shoppers carrying heavy bags from global luxury brands.
Oh, absolutely. It's totally packed with high-end cafes and pristine, sun-drenched pavement.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. But if you were to dig down just a few, metaphorical layers into that concrete, you would hit 1980s disco glitter, post-war survival rations, a literal underground air raid shelter.
And eventually you'd find the blood of a scholar who was hanged to prevent a genocide.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we are excavating today on this deep dive. We are taking a time-traveling walk down this single, incredibly rich road.
It is the ultimate urban paradox, really. I mean, we navigate our cities by surface-level landmarks, right? Like the boutique or the coffee shop.
Right, the stuff you can see today.
But every square foot of that space has been lived in, fought over, and entirely redefined by completely different generations. We are walking on a highly concentrated sociological record.
Which is such a wild concept when you think about it. And actually, I should mention right up front that today's exploration is a special installment belonging to a really fascinating series.
Oh yeah, the podcast series.
Right, it's called The Street Has Its Own Story, or in Greek, O Dromos Eki Tidiki tou Historia. It's created by podcaster Giannis Stefanidis.
It's phenomenal work. It really digs into the micro-histories of these spaces.
It does. And our mission today, using those sources, is to figure out the mechanics of this specific street. Like, how does a road forged in the grit of World War II and named after a martyred cleric evolve into the absolute epicenter of the city's fashion and nightlife?
It's quite the leap. Well, let's look at the current geography first to get our bearings.
Yeah, let's set the scene. If you are strolling down Mitropolitou Iosif today, you are on a vital commercial artery.
Right. It connects two of the city's major commercial veins, Simiski and Mitropolios, and it just runs straight down to the sea.
The sources we're looking at describe this specific stretch as a place where, quote, all fashion is condensed. I mean, you are looking at a highly curated retail ecosystem.
It is essentially a runway.
Totally. You have these massive global powerhouses, brands like Juicy Couture and Prince Oliver, and they are operating shoulder to shoulder with independent, avant-garde Greek designers.
There's actually a specific boutique highlighted in the research called Soma. It's located at number 17.
Oh, right, Soma. That place illustrates the modern retail strategy here perfectly.
It really does, because they aren't just selling clothes, They are dealing in volume and curation.
I read they keep over 800 different product codes in stock, which is insane for a boutique.
Yeah, it's a massive inventory. They blend these timeless wardrobe staples with highly contemporary pieces. It's known as a common secret among the city's shoppers.
Mostly because it hits that rare intersection of high aesthetic value and actual affordability, right?
Exactly. But the entire vibe of the street, generally speaking, is polished, wealthy, and just hyper-visible.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that hyper-visibility is the key. But to understand the mechanics of this street is like an archaeological dig.
Right, but instead of finding ancient pottery, you're digging through layers of vintage fashion.
Yes, because we have to recognize that this culture of deliberate public display is not a modern retail invention at all.
No, not even close. What's fascinating here is that if we step back into the 1980s, the storefronts change, but the social function of the street remains identical.
I love this part. During that decade, Mitropolitou Iosif was the undisputed nerve center of a very sophisticated, highly orchestrated nightlife scene.
It was legendary. I mean, it's funny to think of modern shoppers casually browsing for sweaters there today.
But back in the 80s, simply stepping onto this street was a major event.
Oh, absolutely. The sources detail this intense era anchored by iconic spots like the Pub Fox and the discotheque Regine.
Regine was huge. And the whole concept of, going out was completely different back then. Teenagers and 20-somethings weren't just showing up in jeans and T-shirts.
Definitely not. The men were in meticulously tailored suits, and the women wore these exclusive statement piece dresses just to get past the velvet rope.
Just to get in the door. Which points to a really fascinating phenomenon in urban geography. Physical spaces often retain a specific cultural DNA, even as the economy around them shifts.
That is so true. The mechanics of a discotheque and a high-end boutique are different, obviously.
Right.
But the underlying psychological drive, that desire to see and be seen, the elevation of personal aesthetics, the performance of status, It all stayed deeply rooted in the pavement of this specific block.
But, streets don't just spawn out of nowhere with an inherent sense of glamour. There has to be an incubator period.
Right, a starting point.
Yeah, like how does a specific plot of land acquire that kind of high-status DNA in the first place?
Well, to find that incubator, we have to look way past the velvet ropes of the 80s and the window displays of today.
We have to look straight into the severe post-war grit of the 1940s and 50s.
Exactly. Because the psychological need for glamour that defined the later decades was actually a direct mechanical reaction to the absolute deprivation of this era.
It's hard to even picture. At that time, this glossy runway of a street was literally an unpaved, pothole-filled dirt road.
The contrast is completely jarring. The sources paint this incredibly vivid picture of a neighborhood in raw survival mode.
Yeah, long before the luxury boutiques arrived. That dirt road functioned as a playground for children who had absolutely nothing.
They were out there playing hide-and-seek among the rubble, skipping rope, playing hopscotch, or capso, as it's called there.
There's this one detail from the sources about a game they called Grocery Store that just broke my heart.
Oh, right, where they used the stones.
Yeah. The kids would collect different shaped stones from the street to represent dry goods like lentils or chickpeas.
And they used the actual dust of the unpaved road to simulate flour.
It just perfectly illustrates the profound scarcity of the post-war reality. They were playing with dust.
They were. But while the street level was dirt and dust, the architectural framework that would eventually house the fashion boom was already standing.
Silently watching this whole transition, these buildings were monumental anchors for the neighborhood.
They really were.
So give us a sense of that physical scale. What kinds of buildings were casting shadows over these kids playing in the dirt?
Well, on the eastern corner, where the street intersects with Mitropolitou, you have the I Flionis building.
That's a massive, imposing structure.
Very imposing. It was designed by the architect Themistoklis Skouros and constructed in 1936.
Wow, so right before the war.
Exactly. And further down at Mitropolitou Iosif 14, there is a beautifully ornate building erected in 1925.
Which is now officially listed and protected for its historical value, which is great.
It is. But you have these grand pre-war architectural achievements standing next to some darker history.
Right, because the sources also mention a building on the western corner with Samiski that served a much darker purpose during the 1940s.
Yes, that corner building housed the neighborhood's designated air raid shelter.
This was a reinforced underground space where residents would cram themselves in total darkness.
Just to survive the brutal German bombardments during the occupation.
And to add to the psychological weight of that, directly across the street from that shelter was an empty lot.
An empty lot that the German military had commandeered to use as an active military garage.
That proximity is terrifying. I mean, you have children playing pretend grocery store in the dirt, literally wedged between the architectural elegance of the 1920s, a subterranean bomb shelter, and an occupying army's motor pool.
It's a surreal image. But once the war ends, the physical buildings remain, and the city faces a massive housing and economic crisis.
And this is where the demographic makeup of the street radically shifts, right?
It shifts entirely because of a specific governmental mechanism.
Yeah.
The post-war enoikistasio.
Which were the strict rent control laws.
Exactly. The war had displaced thousands, creating a massive influx of refugees from northern Greece pouring into Thessaloniki.
So to prevent mass homelessness and price gouging, the government froze rents and prohibited property owners from evicting tenants. Let's look at the actual logistics of that for a second, because this rent control situation basically turned the street into a giant multi-class roommate situation.
That's a great way to put it. You have the original, often wealthier tenants holding on to their spacious upper-floor apartments.
But down below, the property owners are forced to partition the semi-basements and ground floors.
Right, to pack in these desperate refugees who have lost absolutely everything.
So you have intense generational wealth living shoulder to shoulder with absolute poverty, literally sharing the same stairwells.
And that pressure cooker environment is precisely what forged the middle class of this street.
The absolute center of this socioeconomic collision happened in number 11A, up on the first floor.
Ah, yes. The location of a bustling dressmaking workshop.
Known simply as to Ergatiko, which translates roughly to the laborer or the workshop, and it was run by a woman named Dina.
Dina's backstory is a masterclass in hustle.
It really is. She arrived in 1922 as a refugee from Panormus in Asia Minor, And she didn't go to some elite fashion academy.
No, the sources say she taught herself the mechanics of tailoring by meticulously taking apart existing garments.
Which is brilliant. She reverse engineered the seams and the construction and then put them back together.
She literally turned survival into an industry. And the labor happening inside to Ergatiko was relentless.
She employed a team of young women, mostly refugees, who were working grueling 12-hour shifts as seamstresses.
But we have to look at the psychological function of their labor here. They were not just manufacturing garments.
No, they were manufacturing normalcy.
That is exactly it. After years of air raids, rationing, and wearing repurposed rags, the women of the city wanted to feel human again.
That makes so much sense. The sources highlight this desperate craving for small, accessible luxuries, like an imported American lipstick, a pair of nylon stockings.
And crucially, a beautiful tailored dress. Kyriadina's workshop was the engine answering that post-war demand.
And because of the rent control, this high-end tailoring was happening right there in the building, accessible to the rising middle class.
The intense 12-hour-a-day labor of those refugee seamstresses established a localized textile microeconomy on that block.
They proved that there was a massive concentrated demand for aesthetics on this specific street.
They quite literally stitched the cultural foundation that allowed those later 1980s discotheques and today's global fashion boutiques to thrive in that exact same physical space.
It's incredible. So we've traced the commercial evolution from a dirt floor survival economy to a hyper-visible fashion capital.
We have. But there's another major layer to this street.
Right, because every time a shopper walks out of one of these high-end boutiques today, they look up and see the street sign, Mitropolitou Iosif.
Before the neon lights, before the sewing machines, and before the bomb shelters, there is the man whose name anchors the entire space.
So who was he?
Well, to understand the namesake, we have to leave the 20th century entirely. We have to travel back to the Ottoman Empire, specifically to around 1761.
He was born Ioannis Antonopoulos in a town called Dimitsana, deep in the Peloponnese.
And he was born into a very prominent family that had a long history of resisting Ottoman rule.
Yeah, his brother Athanasios, for instance, would later become crucial to the Greek Revolution of 1821. He organized the mass manufacture of gunpowder.
But Ioannis took a different path. He wasn't a military tactician.
No, he was an intellectual force. The sources emphasize his incredibly rigorous education.
He studied in his hometown, moved on to the monastic communities of Mount Athos.
And he likely pursued advanced studies in the major cosmopolitan centers of Smyrna and Constantinople. He possessed this deeply comprehensive philosophical education.
This intellectual rigor propelled him quickly through the hierarchy of the Orthodox Church. He was a true scholar cleric.
He served as the Archdeacon of Ephesus, rose to become the great protosyntellus of the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople.
Which, by the way, is a massive administrative and diplomatic role.
Right, and eventually he served as the Metropolitan of Drama and then the Metropolitan of Thessaloniki from 1810 to 1821.
But the public titles are just the surface layer of who he was.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the mechanics of how he operated behind the scenes are fascinating.
Under Ottoman rule, preserving Greek identity was inherently dangerous.
Extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
So Iosif operated essentially as a covert patron of the arts and sciences. He was secretly funneling money to fund the publication of geography and history books.
And we should clarify why funding a geography book was a subversive act back then.
Yeah, it sounds pretty harmless today.
Right, but under an empire, the ruling power dictates the borders and the history. By funding books that taught Greek students about their historical geography and their past, Iosif was intellectually arming the next generation.
He was preserving the concept of a nation that didn't technically exist on a map at the time.
Exactly. He also secretly financed the publication of religious texts, insisting that his financial support remain entirely anonymous.
On top of that, he acted as the chief inspector of Bible translations for the Patriarchate. He was the quiet, intellectual vanguard of his people.
He was. But then, in 1821, the Greek Revolution officially erupts.
And that quiet life of scholarship is violently dragged into the geopolitical spotlight.
The outbreak of the revolution in 1821 created an immediate existential crisis for the Greek population living in Constantinople.
Because they were right in the shadow of the Ottoman Sultan. Which brings us to a historical detail in the sources that seems completely contradictory at first glance.
The excommunication letter.
Yes, Metropolitan Iosif is revered as a hero of the revolution. Yet, When the uprising begins, his signature is actually on the official patriarchal document that excommunicates the Greek revolutionaries.
It's a tough detail to reconcile.
Wait, so the guy who died as a hero for the Greek Revolution actually signed a paper excommunicating the revolutionaries. Let's unpack this. What does this all mean? If he spent his life secretly funding Greek identity, why is his name on the paperwork condemning the very revolution his brother is making gunpowder for?
It is a jarring detail until you examine the mechanics of hostage diplomacy. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Patriarchate in Constantinople was not operating freely.
They were basically operating under the threat of total annihilation.
Exactly. When the revolution broke out, the Ottoman Sultan was enraged. Intelligence reached the church leadership that the Sultan was actively preparing to order a mass genocide of all Orthodox Christians across the empire in retaliation.
Oh, wow. So the document wasn't a betrayal of the revolution at all.
No, it was a desperate firewall to stop a massacre. The church leaders, including Iosif and Patriarch Gregory V, were trapped.
Signing the excommunication letter was a calculated diplomatic sacrifice.
They were attempting to pacify the Sultan's immediate rage, buying time for the unarmed civilian population to escape or prepare.
They willingly destroyed their own political reputations to serve as a shield for millions of innocent people. That is incredibly brave.
It was. But sadly, the shield didn't hold. The Sultan wasn't satisfied with just a piece of paper. He demanded physical hostages from the absolute highest ranks of the community.
So Iosif, along with the Patriarch and several other prominent prelates, were arrested and dragged to the Bastantchi prison.
And the architectural description of this prison in the sources is just haunting.
It really is. It was a damp, lightless semi-basement, illuminated by a single hanging lamp.
The conditions were designed to break them psychologically and physically before execution.
These men, who are the greatest scholars, theologians, and leaders of their era, were thrown onto a dirt floor, beaten, covered in dust, and bound in heavy iron chains.
And Iosif possessed this chilling clarity about his fate throughout all of this.
The sources note that when the initial summons to the Sultan's court arrived, before they were even chained, he turned to his peers.
He said, quote, "We don't need a letter to show us death is before us."
He fully understood the mechanics of the empire. He knew they were marked.
He had absolutely no illusions. He knew that their executions would be used as terror tactics.
And the trigger for that terror came on June 3rd, 1821. Greek revolutionaries had successfully burned a Turkish ship off the coast of Lesbos.
In immediate retaliation for that military loss, the Sultan ordered the execution of the hostages.
Mitropolitou Iosif was taken to Amikoi, a small village on the European shores of the Bosphorus, and he was hanged.
His life is taken, his vast personal library and property are confiscated by the state.
And the secret funding he was providing to the schools in his hometown is abruptly severed.
It's a tragic end. But today, the church honors him not just as a historical figure.
Right, he's recognized as an ethnomartyr, someone who died for the nation, and a hieromartyr, someone who died for the faith.
He sacrificed his intellect, his reputation, and ultimately his life, fully aware that he would never live to see the freedom he was quietly helping to build.
It fundamentally changes how you view a city block, doesn't it?
It really does. It adds so much weight to the space.
I mean, we started this deep dive looking at the brilliant, polished veneer of the modern street, the high-end retail algorithms of Soma, the meticulous tailoring of the 80s club kids.
And then we dug down to the grueling 12-hour shifts of refugee seamstresses surviving rent control.
And the children playing in the dirt above a bomb shelter. And holding all of those layers together is a street sign bearing the name of a man who died in chains in a dark basement so his people could survive.
And that contrast leads to a fascinating inversion of space that we should really consider.
What do you mean?
Well, we've talked about how the street evolved physically, but look at where the power shifted. Mitropolitou Iosif, the namesake of the street, was a man of immense intellect and influence.
Right.
But he was ultimately dragged down into a dark, damp semi-basement to be executed.
Oh, wow. And a century later, it was the dark, damp semi-basement of this exact street that housed the desperate refugees fleeing war.
Exactly. But it was precisely out of those dark, cramped basements, out of the intense labor of women like Kyriadina reverse engineering dresses, that the wealth, the glamour, and the hyper-visible freedom of the street today was born.
The street inverted itself.
It did. The basement became the foundation for the runway.
It makes you wonder, if a street named after a secretive scholar martyr is now famous for its hyper-visible luxury and high-end fashion, What invisible underground struggles are happening in the forgotten spaces of our cities today?
That's a profound question.
Like, what hidden labor in the basements and cramped rooms right beneath our feet is currently dictating the culture of the streets we will be walking on 50 years from now? The street really does have its own story, and we're usually only looking at the very last page.
I think the takeaway for anyone listening is, next time you navigate your city, look past the window displays in the pavement. Consider the mechanics of the space, the layers of survival, and the invisible labor that built the ground you are standing on. Does the vibrant, bustling, fashion-forward life on Mitropolitou Iosif Street today erase the solemn memory of the martyr it was named after, or is that exact freedom and prosperity exactly what he died to protect?
That is something to really sit with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.